Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into DeFi, Decentralized Finance. And you've flagged some interesting stuff here. It looks like while this whole world of, finance built on blockchains, promises, open access and transparency and all that, it seems like there's some pretty big roadblocks. And especially around security.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you see that number, that drop in total value locked in DeFi, going from a high of $200 billion down to like 80 billion in 2022. That's not just a little blip. That's something pretty serious.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it definitely, it makes you wonder, right? Like, is this just because the market's going up and down, or is there something more fundamental going on? And that's what we're going to dig into today. You've given us some really great resources here. We've got some academic research like a survey of DeFi security, property GPT, and risk analysis and decentralized finance, DeFi. There's some more practical guides too, like 7 critical smart contract vulnerabilities, and even a risk framework that's from the SOA, or risk classification framework for decentralized finance protocols. So our goal today is to really pull out those crucial security threats, see where things have actually gone wrong, real world examples, and look at what people are doing to try and make this whole DeFi space safer.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a crucial time for this, right? I mean, more and more people are getting involved in DeFi. Even big institutions are starting to take notice. So understanding, how security works in this space, it's vital for pretty much everyone. Whether you're using DeFi, you're building it, or you're offering services like insurance in this space, you really need to know what you're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the fact that you've put together this really great collection of material, I mean, clearly you've done your homework, so it seems like you're pretty keen to really get down into the nuts and bolts of how security works in this space. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take you on this kind of guided tour through this complex world of DeFi security, and break down the technical stuff and look at some real examples so you can really get a better picture of the risks and more importantly, what's being done to address them.
Exactly.
So let's start right at the foundation. What's the first thing we need to understand when we talk about security in DeFi?
Well, we have to talk about smart contracts, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these are the things that make DeFi protocols actually work.
Yeah, smart contracts.
Yeah, they're like the rule book of DeFi. They automate everything. They cut out the middleman. But the thing is, they're out in the open, right? The code is usually visible to everyone. So the security stakes are really high.
Oh, okay.
If there's a flaw in the design or how it's written, anyone could potentially exploit it. And one of the guides, 7 critical smart contract vulnerabilities, I think, really points out that because of this open nature, we need really, really strong development practices. And it's an area that we're still figuring out as we go, constantly learning and trying to improve.
Okay, so that makes sense. So these smart contracts, they're like the foundation of everything. So what are like the big weaknesses? Like what are the major things that can go wrong with these smart contracts?
So the research that you pulled together, it highlights a bunch of these danger zones, and one really, really basic one, but super important one, is logic errors.
Okay, logic errors.
Yeah, imagine like a flaw in the design of the contract itself, almost like a loophole.
Yeah,
and it can lead to the contract doing something that the developers didn't intend.
Oh,
the SOA framework, or risk classification framework for decentralized finance protocols, points out that these kinds of errors can, they can let attackers manipulate how the contract works and ultimately steal money or other assets, right? And the survey of DeFi security, it actually gives some real world examples. They mention Hagic and TBTC, and in those cases, like, nobody was actually trying to attack them, but the code itself had errors, and these errors caused problems, malfunctions, and led to, big losses that they couldn't get back. It's almost like, building a house with a design flaw that they could make it collapse on its own.
yeah, that's not good.
No, not good at all.
So even if nobody's attacking it, like a coding mistake can just completely ruin things.
Yeah, it can be catastrophic.
All right, so logic errors. So that's one. What other kinds of vulnerabilities should we be kind of keeping an eye out for?
Another really big one is what they call a violation of command and control. And that basically means that, someone who shouldn't have access to certain parts of the contract, certain functions, they end up getting that access. So it's like, imagine a bank where, anyone could just walk in and open any safety deposit box.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The 7 critical smart contract vulnerabilities guide it really stresses how important it is to define roles very clearly, like who can do what, and then to use these code mechanisms called modifiers to enforce these roles and restrictions.
Oh, okay.
And if these controls aren't strict enough, then attackers can gain access to things they shouldn't. And we've seen this in real attacks, like the one on ChainSwap, where attackers were able to modify key parameters in the contract. We also have Vether Asset, where attackers were able to actually drain funds. And then there's the very famous Parity Wallet incident, where attackers basically took ownership of the whole contract.
Wow. So it's all about having the right kind of security and the right kind of locks on the doors, basically. All right, so command and control. Okay, so what about some of those more, technical sounding vulnerabilities like integer overflow and underflow?
Right. So these have to do with how computers handle numbers,
Okay.
right? So imagine you have a counter and it can only count up to a certain number, let's say 255.
Okay.
If you try to add one to it when it's already at 255, instead of going to 256, it might wrap back around to 0.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's called an integer overflow. And underflow is kind of the opposite, right? Where you're trying to subtract from 0 when you can't go any lower.
Mm-hmm.
And it can lead to these weird, unexpected numbers.
Okay.
And in a smart contract, that can have serious consequences. It can reset balances. It can give people unauthorized access, all sorts of problems. So the 7 Critical Smart Contract Vulnerabilities Guide, it gives a really good example of this. They show how a counter in Solidity, which is a programming language for smart contracts, it shows how this counter can overflow and reset. And luckily, they also point out that there are ways to prevent this. There are these special libraries like SafeMath that add extra checks to make sure this doesn't happen. And newer versions of Solidity, like 0.8, 0.x, and later, they actually have these checks built in, which is a huge improvement for security.
Okay, so it's like you're trying to fit too much water in a glass and it spills over, but instead of spilling over, it does something completely crazy and unexpected.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so integer overflow and underflow. Okay, what's another big one?
Okay, so another one that's pretty classic in DeFi, and it's actually been responsible for some pretty big losses, is the reentrancy vulnerability.
Reentrancy, okay.
Yeah. And the 7 Critical Smart Contract Vulnerabilities Guide actually does a pretty good job of explaining this. So imagine your contract sends some money to another contract, right? But before your contract has finished updating its own records to say, hey, I've sent this money, the receiving contract calls back into your contract.
Oh, okay.
And this reentry, this callback, it can trick your contract into sending more money than it should.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the guide actually goes through the typical steps. There's an external call, your contract doesn't quite finish updating its internal state, and then the external contract calls back in.
Yeah.
But importantly, they also talk about ways to prevent this, like this thing called the checks effects interactions pattern.
Checks effects interaction.
Yeah, where you basically do all your checks first, then you update your internal state, and then only then you interact with those external contracts. And they also talk about reentrancy guards, which are these specific code mechanisms that can prevent these callbacks from happening at the wrong time.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. So checks effects interactions. It's like you check what you need to check, you get your own house in order, and then you talk to the outside world.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense. All right, so that's a good one to keep in mind. What about relying on time? Because I noticed something in here about timestamp dependence.
Yeah, timestamp dependence can be a bit of a sneaky vulnerability.
Okay.
So sometimes smart contracts, they need to rely on the timestamp of a block for certain decisions. But the thing is, the miners who create those blocks, they have a little bit of control over the timestamp they include. So if your contract, uses this timestamp for something really important, like, let's say, determining when an auction ends, a malicious miner could potentially mess with that timestamp and gain an advantage.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so the 7 Critical Smart Contract Vulnerabilities Guide, they say don't use block timestamps for anything super critical. Use block numbers instead, because those are, much harder to manipulate. And they also say, sometimes it's good to build in some leeway, like a time buffer. Instead of relying on an exact moment in time, you give a little bit of wiggle room.
Oh, okay. So basically the blockchain's clock, it's not always perfectly reliable.
Yeah, not perfectly reliable.
All right. So timestamp dependence. Got it. What about making sure that only, the right people can actually do things within a contract? Like, how do you make sure that only authorized people can use certain functions?
Right. So that brings us to unauthorized access to contract functions.
Okay.
And that's a big one, because if anyone can just trigger, these sensitive actions within a contract, like withdrawing all the funds, that's obviously a huge risk. It could lead to, big financial losses, data breaches, all sorts of problems. Yeah. Luckily, the 7 Critical Smart Contract Vulnerabilities Guide, they highlight a bunch of ways to prevent this. So you can use access control modifiers in the code. For example, there's this modifier called only owner.
Only owner. Okay.
Which basically restricts a function to be called only by the owner of the contract. They also talk about role-based access control, which is often shortened to RBAC.
RBAC, okay.
And that's where you define different roles with, specific permissions, and you assign users to those roles. And then there's also this technique called using composable contracts. And there's this library called OpenZeppelin that provides this functionality. And it basically lets the contract owner temporarily stop certain functions if there's like an emergency.
Oh, okay.
And the guide, it makes a really good point about the benefits of function modifiers in general. They make the code more reusable, easier to read, and most importantly, more secure. And they do a good job of explaining RBAC, the whole idea of defining roles, assigning users, setting permissions. It's a good way to manage these complex permission structures.
Yeah, it sounds like it. RBAC. Okay. So what happens when one smart contract has to talk to another smart contract, like an external one? Is that a security risk?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a big one. Unchecked external calls. Those are a major source of vulnerabilities.
Unchecked external calls. Okay.
Yeah. And the problem is that when your contract, interacts with another contract, if it's not careful, it can basically open the door for that external contract to run its own malicious code within your contract.
Oh, okay.
And this can lead to those reentrancy problems we talked about earlier, or even other unexpected exploits. And the 7 Critical Smart Contract Vulnerabilities Guide, they give a really clear example of an unsafe withdraw function. How can it allow the recipient to call back and execute any code they want? And then they show how to do it properly using that checks, effects, interactions pattern we talked about. So the takeaway here is just be super careful when your contract is talking to other contracts that you don't necessarily trust.
Yeah, because you don't know what they're going to do. All right, so unchecked external calls. Got it. And I also saw this thing about transaction state dependency. What is that?
Right, so transaction state dependency vulnerabilities. Those happen when a smart contract relies on this global variable called tx.origin. Yeah. And this variable basically tells you the very first address that started the whole transaction.
Oh, okay.
But the problem is that this can be bypassed. So imagine you authorize contract A, but then you interact with, a malicious contract B, and that contract B calls contract A. If contract A is only checking tx.origin, it'll see your address as the originator, right? And it might incorrectly give access, even though the direct caller was this bad contract B. And the survey of DeFi security, they even give a code example. They show a wallet contract that's vulnerable to this type of attack.
Okay, so it's like instead of looking at who's right in front of you, it's looking at who started the whole chain of events. Yep. Okay. All right. So transaction state dependency. Got it. Now finally, in this whole section about smart contract vulnerabilities, it mentions suicidal and greedy contracts.
Right.
Those sound pretty dramatic.
Yeah, they are. And they're also pretty problematic. So suicidal contracts, these refer to the misuse of this instruction in Solidity called self-destruct.
Okay, self-destruct.
Yeah,
okay.
And it's supposed to let the contract owner, deactivate their contract. But attackers can actually exploit this to basically make contracts unusable and potentially even bypass some of the built-in safety measures.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the survey of DeFi security reminds us about this really bad parody wallet attack. There was a misused self-destruct command, and it led to a huge amount of Ether being locked up permanently.
Wow.
Yeah. And the greedy contracts, on the other hand, these are contracts that can, receive cryptocurrency, but they have no way to send it back out. So they basically become like these digital black holes. Money goes in, but never comes out. Yeah. So developers really need to be careful that they don't accidentally create these greedy contracts, and they need to be extremely careful with that self-destruct function.
Oh, wow. That is quite a list of potential problems. Yeah. It just shows how important it is to really carefully design these smart contracts and implement them well and really test them, make sure they're secure.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay, so we've kind of looked at the theoretical vulnerabilities, but let's get down to, like the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about how these vulnerabilities actually play out in real-world DeFi attacks.
Yeah, for sure. And the survey of DeFi security and the SOA's risk classification framework, they're they're really helpful here because they document a ton of real-world incidents.
Hmm.
And the survey does a really good job of categorizing attacks based on like which layer of the blockchain ecosystem they're targeting.
Hmm.
So they talk about the data layer, the peer-to-peer network, the consensus layer, and the smart contract layer itself, which they also call the application layer.
Okay,
Yeah,
so it's like different levels of the DeFi stack that can be attacked.
exactly.
Okay, so let's go through them. Let's start with the data layer. What kind of attacks do we typically see there?
All right, so on the data layer, two big things really stand out. Private key leaks and Oracle mechanism vulnerabilities.
Okay.
So the survey of DeFi security points out that a lot of losses have actually happened just because, developers or users didn't properly protect their private keys
Hmm.
or they fell for phishing scams.
Right.
And in their paper, they have this table 6, that actually lists a bunch of these incidents. And then there are oracles.
Oracles.
Yeah, and these are services that bring off-chain data, like the price of an asset, onto the blockchain so that smart contracts can use them. But if these oracles are compromised or they have vulnerabilities themselves, attackers can actually manipulate the data they provide.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this can lead to, price manipulation or other attacks that can drain funds from DeFi protocols. And the SOA framework, it specifically calls out external dependencies, Oracle risk, as a key part of operational risk.
Okay, so even if the smart contract code is perfect, if it's relying on bad data, it can still be disastrous.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about the inputs.
Okay. All right. So that's the data layer. What about attacks on the peer-to-peer network?
So the survey of DeFi security, it mentions DDoS attacks on the peer-to-peer network. And these might not directly exploit vulnerabilities in smart contracts, but they can basically overwhelm network nodes and really slow down how fast transactions are processed.
Okay.
And they can be used with other attacks to make them more effective or just to create chaos. And the 7 Critical Smart Contract Vulnerabilities Guide also talks about denial of service attacks, or DOS, that can specifically target smart contracts.
Oh, okay. So it's about disrupting the network itself.
Yeah.
All right. So DDoS attacks. Okay. What about attacks on the consensus layer? That's like the core mechanism that keeps the blockchain in agreement, right?
Yeah, that's the heartbeat of the whole system. And the survey talks about these things, 51% attacks. And that's where, a single entity or a group gains control of over half of the blockchain's computing power. And if they have that much control, they could theoretically manipulate the transaction history. And they also mentioned fork attacks, which can, lead to these different versions of the blockchain existing at the same time, and that can create confusion and vulnerabilities. So these are some pretty serious attacks that really target the underlying security of the blockchain itself.
Okay. So those are kind of like systemic threats.
Yeah.
To the whole blockchain. Okay, so now let's get to the smart contract exploits themselves, at the application layer. We talked about all those vulnerabilities. So how do they actually get exploited in real world attacks?
Right. So this is where those theoretical weaknesses turn into real problems, and often, people lose a lot of money.
Yeah.
So, for example, the survey talks about these things called arithmetic vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
And they give examples like Uranium Finance, Compound, and Pizza DeFi, where attackers were able to exploit integer overflow issues. And in one case, they were able to steal up to $80 million.
$80 million from a math error.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. It really highlights how serious these vulnerabilities are.
Absolutely. Okay. So what about re-entrancy attacks? We talked about that as a classic vulnerability.
Right. And the survey highlights this attack on DForce as a really clear example of a reentrancy vulnerability being exploited.
Okay.
And in that attack, they lost about $24 million. So that, again, it really shows how important it is to use those defensive coding patterns that we talked about, like checks, effects, interactions, and reentrancy guards.
Right. Checks, effects, interactions. Yeah. Okay. So what about those more straightforward programming errors, like those logical vulnerabilities?
Right. So the survey talks about a couple of attacks that happened because of these kinds of errors. There was the BZX token copy attack and the Starstream Finance low-level call vulnerability.
Okay.
So in the BZX case, the attacker was basically able to manipulate the contract's logic to duplicate tokens.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and in the Starstream Finance attack, it showed how dangerous it is to make these external calls without really checking the outcome. And in that case, the attacker was able to drain tokens.
Okay.
And we also talked about self-destruction before, right?
Yeah.
And this survey points to this 11 Finance attack as an example. And in that attack, they had this mechanism for emergency situations, like an emergency asset burn. But it's implemented poorly, and it could actually be triggered even during normal withdrawals. So the attacker was able to withdraw their money twice.
Double withdraw. Okay.
Yeah. So it wasn't a direct self-destruct exploit, but it shows how flawed logic around, how a contract is terminated or how you recover from problems, it can be abused.
Right. Okay. So flash loans, those seem to get a lot of attention in the DeFi attack news. How are those used in attacks?
Right. So flash loans, they're really unique to DeFi. They let you borrow a huge amount of cryptocurrency without putting up any collateral, as long as you pay it back within the same transaction. And as the survey explains, this can be really powerful for some legitimate uses like arbitrage, but it also makes it easier for attackers to carry out these sophisticated attacks.
Oh, okay.
And they mentioned the elephant money attack as an example of price manipulation using flash loans. So in that attack, attackers borrowed a lot of stable coins to manipulate the supply and demand.
Yeah.
And then they were able to inflate the price of another token and make a profit.
So it's like having unlimited money for a brief moment to kind of pull off this really complex financial maneuver.
Yeah. And then you pay it back right away, so it minimizes the risk for the attacker.
Right. Okay. So flash loans. Got it. And then finally, what about front running?
So front-running attacks, both the 7 Critical Smart Contract Vulnerabilities Guide and the survey talk about these. And what happens is, an attacker will see a pending transaction on the blockchain, and then they'll pay a slightly higher transaction fee to have their own transaction included in a block before the original one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so this lets them profit from the price movement that original transaction is going to cause.
Yeah.
And the survey specifically mentions sandwich attacks, where an attacker places orders both before and after a large order on a decentralized exchange like Uniswap to extract profit.
Oh, okay. So it's like getting insider information on a stock trade
Exactly.
before it happens and then acting on it. Okay, so attackers have a whole bunch of tricks up their sleeves. What's being done to fight back?
Right. So security in DeFi, it's a constant battle, and people are working on strengthening defenses at all levels of the blockchain.
Right.
So at the data security level, the survey highlights the work being done to make oracles more reliable. And they also talk about secure multi-party computation techniques, specifically threshold ECDSA or TECDSA. And these are advancements in how private keys are managed to make it harder to steal or misuse them.
Oh, okay. So making the data itself more reliable and making it harder to get at those keys.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the peer-to-peer network layer?
So the survey talks about ways to protect against eclipse attacks. That's where an attacker tries to isolate a node from the rest of the network.
Okay.
And they talk about things like hourly reseeding, where nodes regularly reconnect to different peers and looking up peers on random targets in this software called Geth, which is a very widely used Ethereum client. And these are all ways to make it harder for an attacker to kind of control all the connections of a specific node.
Okay, so it's about making the network itself more resilient.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about at the consensus layer? The mechanism that keeps the blockchain in agreement.
Right. So there they talk about tools like Fluffy, which is designed to help find vulnerabilities in the consensus mechanisms themselves.
Okay.
And then there's DeFiPoser, which is used to monitor and analyze these things called blockchain fork behaviors, which can sometimes be a sign of an attack.
Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of work being done at that level.
Okay, so let's focus on the smart contract layer itself, the application layer. We've talked so much about the vulnerabilities there. What kind of security improvements and optimizations are being made?
Right. So this is a very active area, right? People are working on this all the time. And the survey talks about the increasing use of these vulnerability detection tools.
Okay, tools.
Yeah. And these tools use different techniques like symbolic execution, static analysis, machine learning, and fuzzing.
Okay, and what do those do?
Right. So symbolic execution tries to explore all the different ways a contract could run. Static analysis examines the code without actually running it to find potential flaws. And machine learning, can be trained to spot patterns that often indicate vulnerabilities.
Mm.
And then fuzzing is where you feed the contract a bunch of random data or malformed data to see if it breaks.
Okay.
So they're really trying to break things before the attackers do.
Right.
And their paper, the Survey of DeFi Security, they have Table 12, and it gives a good overview of a bunch of different tools and methods. They mentioned this one called Cerium.
Tyrium.
Yeah, and it uses something called a taint engine to track potentially dangerous data and an attack detector to look for known exploit patterns.
Mm.
And they also talk about tools like Eye of Horus and AGIs, which use knowledge graphs, and this thing called taint analysis to track stolen assets after an attack.
Okay. So it's like they're trying to track the money.
Yeah.
See where it goes. All right. So these tools, it's like having a whole army of code reviewers.
Yeah.
Constantly looking for weaknesses.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's finding vulnerabilities before you deploy the contracts, but what about after they're already live?
Right. So it's not just about finding the vulnerabilities before. It's also about making sure that the contracts are working correctly while they're running.
Okay.
So that involves things like runtime monitoring, where systems actually watch the contract and look for any unusual behavior.
Mm.
And then there's this thing called formal verification, which uses mathematical proofs to try and guarantee that the code behaves exactly how it's supposed to under any conditions.
Wow.
Yeah. And the survey mentions tools like Property GPKey and Certora, which are using large language models for this formal verification process.
Okay, so AI helping to mathematically prove that the code is correct. That sounds pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's pretty cutting edge.
All right, so what about security measures at the application level? Within the DeFi protocols themselves.
So at that level, the survey talks about these transaction monitoring systems that track how data flows through a DeFi app. And they look for patterns that might suggest a malicious transaction.
Oh.
Yeah. And then insurance is becoming a bigger and bigger part of DeFi.
Right.
And this gives users a way to protect themselves against different risks. And the survey highlights a couple of platforms. There's Nexus Mutual, which is a decentralized insurance platform, and Ithorisk, which is a centralized one. And then there are newer approaches like options-based insurance from protocols like Open.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And the SOA framework, it also specifically talks about DeFi risk and insurance. And they note that, there's a growing need and a growing demand for ways to transfer risk in this volatile environment.
Right. So even if an attack does happen, users might have a way to get some of their money back.
Exactly.
Okay, that's good. That's a positive development. But despite all of these defenses and all this research, the survey does say that DeFi security is still a big challenge and that attacks are still happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And they emphasize that we need to keep researching, at all levels, but especially the smart contract layer, just because it's so complex and the financial impact of vulnerabilities is so high. And they really stress the importance of learning from past attacks and just continuously monitoring what's happening in the ecosystem.
Yeah, so it's like an arms race.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay. So earlier you mentioned the SOA,